Here's a woman. Her name is Eva Bartlett, and she's an independent Canadian journalist. And this is from. She went to Aleppo. She went there, and she. She has this. Let me see if this is the clip I want to play.
So that's to say that what we've been hearing in the corporate media is not depicting an accurate image of what's happening in Aleppo. The corporate media is saying that the Syrian army is attacking people, and until today, the corporate media is maintaining this, even though the exact opposite is true.
What? The exact opposite is true? The exact opposite is true? So I'm just going to break it down really quickly what's happening in Syria. Saudi Arabia, who we're in bed with because of the petrodollar, wants to overthrow Assad because they want to send a pipeline through Syria and sell natural gas to Europe. Assad said no because Russia sells most of that natural gas to Europe now, and they don't want the competition. So Assad is going with Putin, Russia. They're together. And guess what? Saudi Arabia sends a bunch of terrorists into Syria to start killing people, so we overthrow that government so they can put a pipeline through. And guess who's helping them? We are. The United States is helping to overthrow a sovereign nation. Why? And who are we fighting with? Our enemy, ISIS, and all the other offshoots. We're doing it. That's why Tulsi Gabbard had to put a bill in Congress that says the United States should stop funding terrorists today. So that's what's going on in Syria. Just so you know what's going on in Syria. We're the bad guys, as usual. We need to get the fuck out of Syria and stop the fighting in Syria, not keep fighting, trying to overthrow a government. And who are you going to put in its place? You're going to put ISIS in its place because that's who's fighting him. I know what you think you're going to put in place. You're going to put in a puppet. But let's get back to this. Well, Ron,
well, Jimmy, I was just going to say a side note where she pointed out the misinformation from the corporate media. I mean, you point out the pipeline conflict of interest there. But another big thing to always keep in mind when viewing this stuff, up until recently, MSNBC was owned by General Electric. Now they're owned by a much more principled company known for great customer service, Comcast. But they used to be owned by General Electric, meaning there's always been, my point is, there's always been this pro-war tint in the corporate media.
By the way, General Electric is a huge defense contractor.
Right.
What a better company to bring your news about a war.
Exactly. So there's always been this pro-war bent, and even though the ownership has shifted now, that's not going to go away right away. So we always have a bent pro-war media. We've had that for a long time now. And if other countries did something like that, we'd be outraged. But when we do it, it's free market.
And war sells papers. So let's go back. She has more to say.
I would ask you to follow the voices of people in Syria who, like my colleagues here said, they want you to speak the truth. They're tired of lies. They're very well aware of the lies that our media is purporting and that our human rights groups are purporting. They want an end to the violence. They don't want this war to continue. They didn't ask for this war. But as my colleagues stressed, Syria is a sovereign nation. It has the right to fight against terrorism. And we know that 101 of 193 UN member states have sent terrorists to Syria.
Isn't that wild? 101 nations have sent terrorists into Syria. That's how much they want this pipeline. Isn't that something? And this isn't a Sunni Shia thing. That's what they're going to try and do that. No. The Sunnis are, the people of Syria, according to her, are supporting Assad. They don't want these terrorists in their country turning it into what it is. We're going to go on. She has more to say.
Slaughter and destroy. So Syria is fighting a war against terrorism. It's winning in Aleppo, and hopefully either the terrorists will accept a deal to be transported out of Aleppo. Hopefully they will participate in the Musalaha, the reconciliation, will lay down their arms, will take the amnesty offered to them by the government and which has been taken by thousands of former militants. And hopefully, above all, the U.S. will stop supporting terrorism and stop funding terrorism. And hopefully this new bill will take fire, will be supported, and actually it will be impossible to fund and armed mercenaries from FSA, Ahrar al-Sham, Noruddin al-Zinki, and all the colors in between, because they're all the same terrorists.
So what she just said was the United States is the terrorist in Syria. We're terrorists in Syria. Of course we are. But again, there's another religion and brown people somewhere else that are worse than us because they cut off people's heads with kitchen knives. They're horrible. Oh, guess who's funding them now? We are. Why? Because we're full of shit. That's why, because it's all about fossil fuels and power and money, and it always has been. And when Chris Matthews shows a video of somebody cutting someone's head off with a kitchen knife and freaks out and demands the government go to war over it, that guy's a tool of the military-industrial complex, just like the rest of the media. That's why the media is failing. That's why our country's failing, because the media is failing. Horribly, from the New York Times to CNN to MSNBC to jagoff podcasters to everybody, it's failing. And it comes down to a handful of people willing to tell the truth, like this woman who actually went on the ground there and found out what's happening in Syria and got through all the bullshit lies. That's what's happening in Syria. The exact opposite of what the U.S. news media is telling you is happening. We're talking about the real deal of what's happening in Syria, and we're getting our information from an independent journalist, because that's the only way you can get information these days is from an independent journalist. And her name is Eva Bartlett. She's a Canadian journalist, and she has been in Aleppo many a times, at least 4 times. She's been in Syria a bunch more, and she's been reporting that what the corporate media is reporting about Syria is 100% wrong. That the people of Syria actually support Assad. They want the terrorists out of their goddamn country, meaning us, meaning the United States and ISIS and all the other names of all the other offshoots of all those radical terrorists. But they're basically, Saudi Arabia wants to get a pipeline through Syria, and that's what this is about. It's got nothing to do with human rights or anything else. It's got all about it. So here she is. They've often said that, again, it's the Syrian government that's attacking their own people, and it's not. ISIS is there trying to free the people to terror. And there's moderate rebels. I love that. They're moderate rebels. They moderately cut your head off. And so here she is. She's going to straighten some stuff out about what's actually happening there with the hospital bombing, because that's another thing they say. They say that, it's the Syrian government, Assad, is bombing the hospitals. Is he?
On November 4th, we were at the Castello Road humanitarian crossing. This was a day that was meant to allow the people in eastern areas of Aleppo that were inhabited by terrorists to evacuate. And this was not the first time. On prior occasions, the Syrians and the Russians had opened 8 humanitarian corridors to enable people to leave.
So Syria and Russia opened corridors so people could leave the occupied territories that are occupied by terrorists, so they can get out, so if they don't want to get slaughtered in this war started by terrorists. And what happened?
These were attacked by terrorist factions heavily. Even that day on November 4th, the Castello Road crossing was attacked, twice with mortar shelling when we were there and 5 times afterwards. Clearly, there has been political will and intent by the Syrian government and its Russian allies to enable civilians to leave, to minimize any sort of loss of human life. Clearly.
So it's Syria and Russia that are trying to minimize the loss of human life? It's Syria and Russia that are trying to protect the people against the terrorists, meaning the United States and ISIS and all the other names I can't pronounce that are fighting against them, all the other terrorists trying to overthrow Syria so they can put a pipeline in it?
The terrorists that declare themselves liberators of Syria do not want people to leave. They've been holding civilians hostage. And if you're following reports that are not BBC and that are not New York Times, you will see countless testimonies of civilians, of the 100,000 civilians who've been liberated the last week, saying, thank God for the Syrian Arab Army that liberated us, and the terrorists were hoarding food, they were preventing us from having food. This is all documented. Also documented are that areas in these areas occupied by terrorists, including a school, were housing chemicals used to make chemical weapons. And you could see also the gas canisters that were used to make explosive gas canister bombs. In fact, even when I was in Leiramun, we saw a factory in one of the buildings that was used to make gas canister bombs. In Leiramun, we also saw evidence of the so-called Free Syrian Army that some people say doesn't exist anymore. The 16th Brigades was active there. They had a cell underground, 3 stories below, that was perfectly intact in spite of aerial bombings above ground. And I make this point because people talk about the destruction in Aleppo as if the physical destruction matters. it's the people that the Syrian government and the Syrian people care about. And the destruction in areas occupied by terrorists occurs because the terrorists are bunkering below ground, come up above ground, fire their bombs on civilian populations, and go back below ground. So I just want to address a few other myths. Some of the myths that have been about Aleppo and Syria in general have been that the Syrian government and army are starving the population. Again, I refer to testimonies of people, even people I met with in November. I met with a family of displaced people from El Halak, which is north of Bustan al-Pasha, which was an area, both areas occupied by terrorists. At that time, when I met them on November 10th, he told me that they had fled along with about 40 others on about 20 days prior, and that they had tried twice prior to flee, but they were prevented violently so from doing so by the terrorists that inhabited those areas. This is the case. These are the testimonies coming out of Aleppo now. People saying, we tried to flee, they wouldn't let us, they shot at us. There are also videos showing people who did manage to flee coming under fire and the Syrian army actually protecting them, acting as human shields. So that's to say that what we've been hearing in the corporate media is not depicting an accurate image of what's happening in Aleppo. The corporate media is saying that the Syrian army is attacking people, and until today, the corporate media is maintaining this, even though the exact opposite is true.
Ron, anything to say about that?
Wow.
Yeah, right.
Wow. It's, when you have conflict of interest and you don't have boots on the ground, this can happen. And so many, it's so common in our populace that people aren't just aware of the fact that we have a compromised media structure. And this is just another testament to that. Because like a lot of the general person, that doesn't really hit them. Like, oh, they're not just here they actually have all these conflicts of interest, one of them being energy.
And let me say this about the media. If CNN did send somebody to Syria, whenever they do send somebody, they usually send them embedded with like the U.S. military. So they only see what the U.S. military wants them to see. They rely on the U.S. military for their protection. So it's mostly just a love letter to the U.S. military, right? Like I'm thinking, for some reason in my head, I remember when Ted Koppel went to Iraq, and he was embedded. They embed. That's what they call it. And I just remember what a worthless. It's like, what are you going to tell us? This is somebody who's got a lot to tell us. And again, don't trust the corporate media. Just what you always knew. They're all full of shit. It's a big club, and you ain't in it. It's a big club, right? It's a big millionaires club. Everybody on MSNBC is a big-time millionaire, right? They make more money in a day than most Americans make in a whole year. Those are the people, those are the lefties bringing you the news. Just keep that in mind. And this is a real journalist. That's somebody who actually wants to find out what's going on. And you see the propaganda. Do you see what she talked about in her country, meaning Canada, how they closed the Syrian embassy? Because Syria's bad. It's all propaganda. It's all about fossil fuels. And it's more Western imperialism. It's more bullshit. And, talk about fake news. And everybody's screaming about fake news. Everything you see on TV about Syria is fake news. Just remember.